Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Maria Soebi, and I'm the GSA Procurement Ombudsman and Industry Liaison. As a preliminary matter, I wanted to make sure everyone is aware that today's meeting is being recorded. The PowerPoint slides and portions of this recording will be posted on the GSA COVID website at a later date, but the slides will be shared via email to all the webinar registrants after this webinar. We are also aware that there are people who were not able to register because we are over capacity. So please share those slides with others and remind them to keep checking the GSA COVID website frequently for updates. Now, let me thank you all for the overwhelming response to our request to provide us with questions and feedback in advance of this session. They were very informative and helped us to prepare for this event. We read them all, but we cannot address all the questions during today's session. However, most of them will be or already have been answered during today's session by the presentation. You will see the GSA implementation policy document that's on the COVID website, the FAQs posted on the GSA COVID website, and the FAQs posted on the Safer Workforce Task Force. All the links to these websites are in the slide presentation that will be sent to you, so don't worry about where to find them right now. So we will start this session off with GSA's most senior procurement officials talking you through a presentation explaining GSA's implementation of the executive order. Since we have more questions and we have time to address today, let me note a few things up front. One, this webinar will focus only on GSA's policy and GSA's implementation of the EO. It does not address other agencies' policies and implementation of the EO. Because we have a lot of information to share with you, we will not take questions during the presentation. We have time reserved later on the agenda for questions and answers, so don't worry, you will get to say your piece. As we will not get to answer all the questions asked during session, we will collect and respond to those frequently asked questions only on GSA website, on the same COVID website I mentioned before. And speaking of questions, we will be monitoring the Q&A function only. So please submit all your questions using that function. We will not be monitoring the chat function and will not use the raise hand function. Now, enough of housekeeping, and let me introduce you to our senior officials who will be presenting today. First, we have Jeff Kosis, GSA's senior procurement official, and he will take us through the highlights of the GSA implementation policy. Jeff will be followed by Mark Lee, the Assistant Commissioner, Office of Policy and Compliance. And Mark will explain how the Federal Acquisition Service will be implementing this EO. Then we will have Tracy Marcinowski, who's the Assistant Commissioner for Acquisition in the Public Building Service. Tracy will explain how the acquisition arm of PBS will be implementing this EO. And closing out the presentation will be John Thomas, the Acting Assistant Commissioner, PBS Office of Leasing. John will explain how the EO will be implemented on the PBS leasing side. I will then come back and start off the question and answer session with some prepared Q&As that you all were so gracious to send in advance. And then we will open up the session to the audience. At the end of that session, I will come back and close us out. I now turn the floor over to Jeff Kosis. Jeff, take it away.
Thank you, Maria. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, what we're looking to do is to take you through the executive order, through the guidance put out by the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force, and through GSA's implementation. Let's move to the next slide, please, as we are doing so. This effort, this is part of our ongoing commitment to healthy, productive industry relationships. We believe that it's important that we communicate, that we explain the thought process, that we leave you clear on what the requirements are, how they work, and the timelines involved. As Maria indicated, we have received a lot of questions, and we have tried to thread several answers throughout the presentation, and then set a good amount of time this afternoon to go deeper into questions. after we've taken you through the highlights, through the basics, through the overview, I'll take you through the 4 or 5 most frequent questions that we've been hearing, and hopefully that will address what many of you are most looking to know. Let's move forward to the next slide, please, and let's talk about what the executive order itself is and isn't. The president announced a series of executive actions as part of his effort to lead the fight against COVID. There was a vaccine mandate issued for federal employees, and those of us who are federal employees are in the process of providing evidence to our home agencies of how we have complied with the COVID mandate. The president has announced that OSHA within Department of Labor will be implementing its own rulemaking process on emergency order to require either vaccination or regular testing for companies with 100 or more employees. And the president signed the executive order that we're here to discuss this afternoon, the one on ensuring that the contractors are following adequate COVID safety protocols, on September 9th. The executive order directed the creation of a clause that has to apply in all covered contracts and all contract-like instruments. We're going to come back and talk about those 2 terms because you need to understand what a covered contract is and what a contract-like instrument is in order to be able to implement this. The executive order established several timelines. First, it directed the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force to issue guidance that would explain the protocols, how it applies to prime and subcontractors. The Safer Federal Workforce Task Force was given a September 24th deadline. And indeed, the task force met that deadline, working very closely with the FAR Council. The FAR Council, in turn, was given an October 8th deadline to establish a new clause. I don't recall another executive order that directed the use of a deviation to implement, or one that had a time period of less than a month from EO signature to a clause. But that's what we're seeing here. Because the clause itself has to start going into federal contracts as of October 15th, the FAR Council concluded a week was just not enough time and worked closely with the task force. And you saw GSA, DoD, and NASA came up with the FAR clause on September 30th, and all 3 agencies implemented their deviations on that date. We figured we need at least the 2 weeks to be able to get our systems ready, our internal communication, our external communication to explain what was going on and to cover that new clause. Let's hit the next slide, please. So here, there's 3 big things that the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force specified in their guidance. First, they specified a requirement for covered contractor employees. And once again, we're on that covered word, which I will explain. So this was a full vaccination requirement. All covered contractor employees need to be fully vaccinated by December 8th. That doesn't mean in the process. That means 2 weeks past the second shot on the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine, or 2 weeks past the first shot on the Johnson & Johnson or other approved single dose vaccines. This requirement explicitly flows down to subcontractors over the SAT, and we'll talk about that. The second requirement is one for covered contractors to make sure that your employees are following the CDC protocols. I think most of you are pretty familiar with the CDC protocols. This is all about masking. This is all about social distancing and so forth. The expectation is in areas of high transmission that your covered employees will be wearing masks, adhering to whatever CDC guidance is in effect at that time. And third, contractors are required to designate a lead person for compliance with the mandate. The guidance doesn't get into a lot of specifics as to the rank of the person, where in the organizational hierarchy he or she sits, the number of people that you need. It just said somebody has to be responsible for that coordination, for the communication, for making sure that the contractor is aware of the requirements. Totally up to you as our contractors to figure out who those people are, where they sit in your organization. Is one sufficient? Is it a part-time duty for one? Do you need a whole bunch if you're a defense giant? Business decision, totally how you want to apply that. Now, the guidance that the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force put out moved beyond what was specified in the executive order. It encouraged a much broader implementation. We're going to get into that. It's important to recognize where is it a mandatory implementation and where is it a strongly encouraged implementation. But to start with, maybe the single question we hear most often: if a contractor employee is working from home, does that person need to be vaccinated? And the answer, if that person is working on a federal contract, it does not matter where they're working from. The person working on a contract from home needs to be vaccinated. Let's jump into the next slide if we can. Here, I want to go slowly, take you through who does the vaccination requirement apply to. This is an area, it can get pretty confusing. So I like to think of it and present it as three major circles. Going to take you through each of these circles, but recognize there is a reasonable accommodation exception. You all are familiar with reasonable accommodations. You apply it to your employees in many other circumstances. So the task force guidance says apply the same reasonable accommodation process for people who have a medical exemption, for people who are asking for a religious exemption. Evaluate those things as you would any other request for a reasonable accommodation. Okay, let's set that off to the side. Who needs to be vaccinated? Circle one, any contractor employee who works on a covered contract. And again, we'll define the term covered contract in a minute. Any employee, if they work an hour a week on that contract, they need to be vaccinated. If they work from home on that contract, they need to be vaccinated. If they work from the office on the contract, they need to be vaccinated. This is a 100% mandate. Any contractor employee who works on the covered contract, no exceptions, no matter how little time they spend on the contract. Let's expand this universe now of who we're talking about. The second circle, you'll find it in the guidance, is any contract employee who works in connection with a covered contract. So, that's may not be familiar wording. What does it mean to work in connection with a covered contract? This is anybody whose work is necessary for performance of the contract. Think, for example, maybe the HR professional who is hiring your employee to work on the contract. Maybe this is the billing clerk who is sending out the invoice. Maybe this is the quality control officer who's inspecting. Maybe this is the training official. Maybe this is the lawyer who's reviewing this guidance. Whoever in your company is connected to that contract, they are subject to the vaccination mandate. If you want a shorthand, think of people you put in your overhead pool. If they're in the overhead pool, they are probably working in connection with a contract. Now, let's expand this one more time. This is the broadest group who needs to be vaccinated based on the clause and based on the guidance. It's anybody who comes into contact with the individual who's either in circle one or circle two. Let's take, for example, that you have an employee who is working in an office setting in one of your facilities. Who else might come into contact with them? Do you have a shared elevator, for example? Do you have a shared cafeteria? Do you have a shared parking garage? Are there shared restrooms? If somebody is going to come into contact with a covered employee, working on that covered contract, then that person also needs to be vaccinated. This does not mean, repeat, does not mean every one of your employees needs to be vaccinated. If they are not working on the contract, if they are not coming into contact with somebody who works on the contract, there's no vaccination mandate. For example, maybe you have an employee who works from home full-time, but not on a government contract. There's no vaccination mandate for that person. Maybe you have a cleaning crew who works the night shift, not in your overhead pool, and maybe these people never come into contact with anybody who works on a contract. In that case, the vaccination mandate would not apply. So who needs to be vaccinated? One, any contractor working on a covered contract. Two, anybody working in connection with a contract. And three, anybody who comes into contact with either of those groups. Hopefully that helps separate who does and does not need to be vaccinated. Let's jump to the next slide, please. So we have the task force guidance. Let's start translating that now into contracting language. As I told you, the FAR Council developed a standard clause to include in contracts. They did it by deviation. That means that this action happens before the rulemaking process commences. There will be a public rule. It will go out for notice and comment. You'll have the opportunity to comment on that proposed rule, but the actions are being implemented right now through the class deviation. Because this is a GSA audience, we're emphasizing, hey, this is motivated by the health, by the safety of GSA employees, GSA contractors, and their families. And this is the administration's priority. GSA's deviation goes beyond simply picking up the FAR text and repeating it. It provides instructions on how to modify the contracts, how to determine whether or not the contract is covered, and it picks up the task force guidance. The task force, remember, said go broadly, go beyond what the EO mandates, and GSA did so. At the bottom of the slide, you see a link to the GSA COVID website. On this page, you will find many of the FAQs. Once this presentation is made 508 compliant, you'll find large portions of this presentation and a wealth of other support materials. So let me encourage you, if you have later questions, if you want to review things, the COVID webpage linked on this slide is a great resource. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned the term covered over and over again. So let's be specific. What is a covered contract? What is not a covered contract? One, the executive order explicitly applies to FAR-based contracts and to non-FAR-based contracts. It calls out both very clearly. It also uses the term contract-like instrument. And in defining what on earth is a contract-like instrument, the executive order references a definition supplied by the Department of Labor in a earlier proposed rule. But let me simplify it. A contract-like instrument includes a lease on real property. So if you are one of GSA's 8,000 lessors, you have a contract-like instrument, you are covered. It applies to concessions. So if you have a contract, for instance, running a federal cafeteria or vending station, you're covered. It applies to licenses and permits. If you are a GSA childcare center, for example, or if you are on outlease, you're covered. It applies to intergovernmental service agreements. It applies to task orders and job orders. And here I want to underline that, especially for our federal supply schedule contractors, our GWAC contractors, our OASIS contractors, our EIS contractors. and the other GSA IDIQ contractors. A task order is treated in the definition as a contract-like instrument. And that's going to be critical because that gets into eligibility for new work. So where's the contract required? It's required for all contracts and all those contract-like instruments I just ran through that are one, above the simplified acquisition threshold or the simplified lease acquisition threshold, 250,000, two, for services, or three, for construction. So if you have a contract for any type of service, IT services, consulting services, travel services, financial services, facility maintenance, design, any type of service over 250, you are a covered contract. The executive order applies to you, the clause applies to you. It applies to all of our construction contracts above 250,000 without exception. And as noted, it applies to all our leases above 250,000. That's what the executive order mandated. What the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force guidance said is apply it more broadly. We encourage you to apply it to contracts at or below that $250,000 level. And we encourage you to apply it to contracts for products. So for example, if you are an automotive manufacturer and you're supporting the GSA fleet, you are strongly encouraged to accept the modification to add the clause to ensure the workforce is vaccinated. Under the executive order, it is not mandatory. It is strongly encouraged. If your contract is below 250,000, it's not mandatory, but we are strongly encouraging you to accept it. And because we are strongly encouraging you, GSA either has sent or is in the process of sending the clause out to all of our contractors. Next slide, please. So where does the requirement not apply? And you'll see there are very few cases where it does not apply. It does not apply to micro purchases. We are not sending anything out to micro purchase vendors. It does not apply to site acquisition where we are buying land. It doesn't apply to our disposal of real or personal property. These are our sales contracting officers. If we are selling used furniture, if we are selling an unneeded office building, the clause does not apply. It does not apply to those employees who work outside of the US and its outlying areas. And similarly, it does not apply to contracts with Indian tribes when that contract is done under the Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. Contracts under the Self-Determination Act are akin to contracts with foreign governments, and so the clause does not apply. But if you're an Alaska Native corporation working on a standard GSA contract, well, that's not under Self-Determination Act. The clause does apply. Next slide, please. So about the clause, let's cover some key concepts. The clause is very simple. It says nothing more than, hey, contractor, follow the guidance from the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force. It directs you flow that clause down to your subcontracts at all tiers until you get to subcontracts over 250 only for products. We're trying to make this simple, clear, and straightforward. At GSA, we are going to use the standard FAR clause created through the deviation on all of our contracts, whether they are FAR-based or not. FAST will use this clause across the board, including in our CSO contracts that are not FAR-based. PBS will use this in our leasing and concessions, which are not FAR-based. Our internal acquisition shop will use this in their contracts. So the clause, it applies globally across the board. What does the clause require? It requires you to follow the clause. There's no fill-ins. There's no representation. There's no certification. There's no attestation. There is no information collection. We are not asking you for any information that you have completed the vaccinations. We're not asking you for health records. The GSA acquisition workforce has been instructed not to ask for information about any individual contractor employee. We are not looking to own, house, maintain any of this medical information. We want you to manage it. So no data collection, simply a requirement, follow the clause, much as you have in clauses such as drug-free workplace. Follow it, do what the clause says. There's no reporting, there's no data collection associated. Next slide, please. So we've given our workforce some key information on what we're expecting from them. For solicitations, if it's issued on or after the 15th, it will include the clause. No question, straightforward. It's being put in our automated contract writing systems. If for a solicitation that has already been issued, but there has not yet been an award, the CO has a choice. They can amend the solicitation or they can incorporate it into the apparent successful award. Either way, by the time that contract gets awarded, the clause will have been added. Next slide, please. Very similarly, procedures for existing contracts. Well, we will have this clause in all of our contracts awarded on or after October 15th, and we are working hard to modify this into all of our existing contracts. For our IDIQs, for our schedules, our GUX, and so forth, I want to take you back to that definition of contract-like instrument. Because this applies to contract-like instruments, the impact is you are not eligible for new work after November 14th unless you have signed the mod. So if you sign the mod today, you're in great shape. Thank you. If you do not sign the mod and November 15th comes along, you will not be eligible for new work and you will remain ineligible until such time as you have signed the mod. We are not terminating contracts. We are not ending contracts. But if you have an IDIQ or scheduled contract, you cannot obtain new work after November 14th. If you have a contract that's where this is not mandatory but strongly encouraged, this remains your business decision. We will not be terminating the contract, but we will strongly encourage you to follow this as a best practice. We've tried to keep this process as simple for our workforce as possible. Both FAST and PBS have been using different automated tools to send these modifications out by the thousands. Mark and Tracy will tell you all the ones that have gone out. And when John talks about leasing, I believe that leasing mods begin to flow later today. You'll receive the mod for every one of your contracts. Those of you who have a lot of GSA contracts, you're going to receive a lot of mods, and you'll notice pretty much the same cover letter on each and every one of them, an attempt to explain this requirement. Next slide, please. Here, just I want to slow down. I want to reemphasize because this is a really important point. Under the executive order, we do not have the authority to extend a contract, to exercise an option, or to renew that contract until the mod has been finalized. There are no exceptions to that created in the executive order. So you have the right to make the business decision not to accept that mod, and that's your call. But part of the cost of that call is your contract will not be renewed, extended, and so forth. And if you're an IDIQ holder, if you're a schedule holder, and you have not accepted that mod by November 14th, well, we don't want to confuse or mislead our customers. So we will begin temporarily hiding information on our websites and e-tools so that orders are not going to contractors who have not accepted the mod, who are not in compliance with the COVID vaccination requirements. Next slide, please. Let's talk about enforcement. Uh, for our workforce, we've told our COs, you enforce this just like any other contractual requirement, straightforward. But key point for you all, as federal contractors, something that we absolutely insisted be in the guidance, something that the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force agreed, they created an FAQ that was incorporated into the clause. And the FAQ says, contractor, you can assume your subcontractor is complying absent credible evidence otherwise. So you do not have a responsibility to go back and verify subcontractor compliance. You don't have a requirement to do a determination before entering into a subcontractual relationship. You have a requirement to flow that clause down, and unless you have evidence otherwise, you can assume that subcontractor is in compliance. Now, somewhere in contract administration, there may well be a concern about vaccination status of a particular employee. If that happens, we told our CEOs, ask the contractor, is the employee in compliance with the mandate? Do not ask for their health information. Do not ask for proof of vaccination. So CO should go to you as the contract administrator. You should work with your organization and come back and say, yes, this employee is in compliance with the mandate, or no, this employee is not in compliance with the mandate. That's the extent of the answer we would want if we ever have reason to ask about a particular employee. But staying on this slide, part of where we were looking to ensure that this is not creating a significant burden on our industry partners is in that FAQ and saying you can assume compliance by your subcontractor absent credible information otherwise. And similarly, we have told our workforce that they can assume compliance by you as our contractor absent credible evidence otherwise. Next slide, please. At this point, let me turn it over to my colleague, Mark Lee, who's going to take you into some details on how Federal Acquisition Service is moving towards implementation.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you, Jeff, and good afternoon or good morning to our industry partners, wherever you may sit in the world today. And I just want to thank you for participating in this important industry engagement. The past several years, we've all been affected by the pandemic, whether personally and professionally. Together, we've shown tremendous resilience in serving our mutual customer and the taxpayer, and I have no doubt that we'll continue to do so. With that, if we could hit the next slide, just want to provide a quick overview. As Jeff mentioned, this really is a GSA-wide effort to address implementation. We're attempting to be as consistent as possible within GSA. As he mentioned, on September 30th, the GSA class deviation was issued, and particularly attachment C clarifies the applicability of this across all the acquisition programs across the Federal Acquisition Service. So really first at the high level about how FAST is implementing is we will include the clause in any new applicable contracts or contract-like instruments awarded on or after October 15th. And then we are bilaterally modifying all our existing contracts and applicable contract-like instruments before October 15th. And the key word there is applicable. So if we can go to the next slide, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about applicability. So first, I'm really going to cover what contracts across the Federal Acquisition Service does this cover. And the first is the Federal Supply Schedules Program. This is, many of you participate in this program. It's the largest commercial IDIQ program for products, services, and solutions across the government. And so what we've instructed our contracting officers is to incorporate the clause into all new and existing FSS contracts, including contracts that are solely for products. And so the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force, their guidance strongly encourages agencies to incorporate the clause in the contracts that are solely for products. And in looking at the schedules, we determined that it was not administratively feasible to distinguish FS contracts that are solely from products from contracts that include ancillary type services. So these are things like installation and maintenance and training and ancillary services, or services provided through our order level materials special item number. And so we wanted to keep this really as simple as possible. So requiring the contract clause in all FSS contracts really simplifies compliance tracking, our communications with you as our industry partners, and also our messaging efforts to our customers. And we've begun issuing issuing the mass mod that went out on Friday, October 8th, and it's an automated process, and we're issuing about 3,000 modifications per day. You may even have gotten it over the weekend because we are running those batches as quickly as possible. The next program I really want to talk about is our government-wide acquisition contracts, and these are indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts for IT. So whether you hold Alliant 2 or 8A Stars or VET, these are IT services contracts and do require the clause. And so for those contracts, we will be going out with a bilateral modification starting on October 15th. The next set of contracts are our multi-agency contracts. And so GSA holds many services, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts that are available for government-wide use and are required to include the clause. So examples of this, you could be an OASIS contract or an HCATCH contract, or hold several of our telecommunication contracts, whether that's EIS, networks, local telecom. You could be holding our building maintenance and operation contracts. So these modifications, they will be going out on October 15th as well. Also, GSA has a unique authority to buy innovative IT up to 10 million, something we call commercial solution openings. And though these aren't covered by the federal acquisition regulation, they do fit that definition of the EEO of a contract-like instrument. And so for those contracts, we will be requiring the inclusion of the clause. The next area is called tenders of service. And so FAST uses a tender procurement for freight or household goods transportation or services. And again, this is one that we consider tenders of service a contract-like instrument under the EU. So therefore, in our tender service agreements, we will be, those terms and conditions, we will be including the clause, and we will be communicating that out in terms of that. If it is below the simplified acquisition threshold, which is 250,000 for those tenders, we will not be requiring it, but we will strongly be encouraging it. Next, I want to talk about assisted acquisition, and this is really where the Federal Acquisition Service does the buy on behalf of another federal agency. And because we're obligating other federal agencies money, we're obligated to follow their policies. So our contracting officers will be following the funding agency policy. That being said, many of our assisted acquisition are task and delivery orders. And so in general, GSA will not be modifying the order if that underlying IDIQ contract, whether that be a schedule, a GWAC, a multi-agency contract like OASIS, is modified. And in fact, many of our customer agencies are counting on GSA and our industry partners to quickly modify our IDIQ contracts to prevent disruption on existing task orders and the placement of new orders. So FAST is really encouraging our IDIQ contractors to accept this modification as quickly as possible. This will help our mutual customer and the agencies out there continue to deliver mission critical requirements. If you do have an IDIQ contract with assisted acquisition, you will be receiving a request for bilateral modification. Now let me talk about those programs where our contracting officers are going to be encouraging contractors to accept a bilateral modification. First is FAS is the mandatory source for motor vehicles across the federal government. And so our automotive contracts are solely for products and the ones that are outside FSS. And so for those contracts that are outside the Federal Supply Schedules program, we will be strongly encouraging the modification. We do have the commercial platforms program that is a no-cost services contract that is valued under the simplified acquisition threshold. And so for those portal providers, we will be going out with a bilateral modification to highly encourage them to accept this. And then lastly, as I previously mentioned, tenders for services below the simplified acquisition threshold, which is $250,000, we will be highly encouraging folks to accept the clause through a bilateral modification. Now let's turn our attention to orders under against FAS IDIQs, and if we can hit the next slide, please. So how is this going to impact new orders and existing orders? So for new orders beginning November 14th, prior to placing orders, CEOs across the government should be reviewing to ensure that the clause has been incorporated in the underlying contract. If it has not, for new orders, they would need to amend the request for quote prior to doing that if it's not included already in the underlying contract. For existing contracts, the same, they need to review the contract and make sure that the clause is in the contract. If it is not in there, they can bilaterally modify that individual order. But ideally, what we want to do to support our mutual customer agencies is to make sure that we've agreed to it at the IDIQ contract level. And if you agree to the clause at the IDIQ contract level, it will flow down to all the resulting orders underneath the contract. So with this, I really want to put out a little bit of a call of action to our industry partners. I want to stress to you how critical it is to accept this bilateral modification. And I want to thank the 2,737 industry partners as of midnight last night that have already accepted the modification. GSA and FAS has been talking and briefing all the senior procurement executives across government on our implementation approach. And we've heard loud and clear from our customer agencies that the help they're looking from GSA and from you is to mitigate the impact of this to new awards and excising options. And so think about not only your acceptance of this as a contractual requirement, but as something in terms of delivering the customer experience. And if your customer has to, can't exercise an option to extend, or there's delays in awarding a contract, that impacts their mission and service delivery, and it impacts the customer experience that they're having both with GSA and you as our industry partners. So if we could hit the next slide, I want to talk about some tools. Go forward, please. Next slide. I want to talk about some tools that we're putting in place to help deliver that excellent customer experience. So first, we are developing a dashboard that our customers can go on to GSA's website and quickly see if the clause has been incorporated into that IDIQ contract. So whether that's the schedules, the GWACs, our multi-agency contracts. And so they can quickly identify, hey, has this contract been modified or not? And this will allow them after November 14th to understand who they can place new awards with and who they can exercise options. We plan to launch this dashboard in late October. Some of you may be familiar with this type of dashboard. We utilize the same approach in implementing Section 889 of the fiscal year 19 National Defense Authorization Act that included a prohibition on certain telecom and audio surveillance equipment. And it was a very similar approach where you could not exercise an option or make a new award unless those terms and conditions were agreed to. And we'll say that we had thousands and thousands of customers viewing this dashboard regular, basically checking this. If we could hit the next slide, we already have an existing mechanism that addresses our federal supply schedule contracts And this is in our schedules e-library. It's called Contracts Online. And once you accept that bilateral modification, this website is updated automatically that shows that you have accepted that contract modification and that clause is in your contract. So for federal supply schedule customers, we'll be referring them to this as well. So just to close out, again, I want to thank you all for attending this event here today. Together, FAST and our industry partners provide important acquisition solutions across the federal government. It is time for us to act quickly on acceptance of these bilateral modifications to continue to serve our mutual customers. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Tracy Marcinowski in the Public Building Service. Take it away, Tracy.
Thank you, Mark. So first off, I'd like to echo what Mark said and thank you for joining us today and helping us support the implementation of Executive Order 14042. If we can move to the next slide, I'm going to spend some time today explaining what PBS Acquisitions is doing to keep our buildings safe. And we appreciate your support as we implement this. So on our existing contracts, nearly all of PBS's contracts and orders, approximately 14,000, should have received a bilateral modification issued utilizing an automated bot that we have. The bot should have sent you a cover letter and a modification. And we are asking all of our contractors to sign the modifications and return them to their contracting officers, who will then finalize and ensure you have a completed copy of the modification. Can we go to the next slide? All of our existing solicitations are being amended in accordance with the executive order and the class deviation to implement here at GSA. If they have not been amended yet, they will be by October 15th. New solicitations and contracts will automatically include the new clause, and all of our PDS construction templates, which I know our construction contractors are familiar with, have been updated to include the new clause. Next slide, please. So as I said, we are using a robotics process automation, or a bot, to issue all of our modifications, similar to how we did Section 889 a couple of years ago. Anything that was done outside of our contract writing system, for various reasons, system was down, was unable to process for some odd reason, manual contract modifications will be emailed directly to contractors from the contracting officers. And as I said, we are in the process of amending all existing solicitations and ensuring that the clause will be in all new solicitations as they are issued. We are keeping track of all modifications that are issued. This is not going to be a publicly published dashboard. It is just for our internal usage. As of a few minutes ago, we only have about 100 modifications left to send. So everyone here who has a PBS contract should have received a modification already, and we ask for your support in signing those and getting them back to your contracting officers as soon as possible so that we can get those closed out and ensure, especially if you are an IDIQ holder, that we can continue to issue task orders against your IDIQ after November 14th. And again, thank you so much for your support and joining us today. Your support over the past 18 months during this pandemic has been invaluable to keeping our buildings safe and providing a safe and healthy workplace for those individuals who are still going into PBS managed buildings. At this time, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, John Thomas, to discuss PBS leasing.
Thanks, Tracy. I appreciate it. So for leasing, this afternoon, if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, perfect. So this afternoon, the Office of Leasing will begin sending out nearly 8,000 of its bilateral lease amendments to our lessors for signature. We will be using an automated solution. We expect well, we will begin sending these amendments out this afternoon. We will complete issuing the bilateral amendments for signature tomorrow afternoon. And our zonal administrative lease contracting officers will be countersigning the lease amendments. We are going to be using DocuSign to execute these amendments, so that we will be able to track the status as they become signed. And if we can go to the next slide. Okay. So we will be sending these lease amendments out for all of our leases, including those leases above the simplified lease acquisition threshold and those leases below the above the simplified lease acquisition threshold and those below the simplified lease acquisition threshold. For leases below the simplified lease acquisition threshold, lessor agreement is encouraged, but not mandatory. Again, we are asking for your help in implementing this executive order. So we are asking all of our lessors to sign the amendment. For leases above the simplified lease acquisition threshold, GSA will not be able to extend or renew a lease if a lessor does not agree to the clause. So in other words, if lessor will not sign, we are not able, per the executive order, to extend or renew the lease. And with that, if we can go to the next slide. So a leases awarded on or after October 15th must include the clause. This clause is included in our general clauses, which or eventually do become part of our lease agreement. New requests for lease proposals issued on or after October 15th must include this clause. Where the due date for final proposal revisions has already passed, the GSA will be sending the clause to the lessor or to the apparent successful offeror for signature. And with that, I'd like to thank you. That's part of my presentation, and I will turn it back over to Maria.
All right, thanks, John, Jeff, Mark, and Tracy. As you see on this last slide here, as I promised, we have the websites the links to the websites we mentioned that information will be on. And I know we just threw a lot of information at you. And would you guess what the number one question we've gotten so far is? It's, will the slides be shared or posted? And the answer to that hot topic is absolutely. After this session, we will PDF and send those slides out. So if you're registered, you're on this call, you are registered. If you're registered, you're going to get the slides. We are also going to post them on that GSA COVID website that's right at the top here. We just have to make them 508 compliant, so those might not be posted till tomorrow. And as I said, please feel free to share the slides once we send them out to you as broadly as possible.